Hello and welcome to Faith in the Fallout. We are Kyle and Laura Drake. We've been married since 2011 and we have two kids and live in Southern Michigan. We attended Radiant Church Jackson in Jackson, Michigan for about 10 years and we are heavily involved in the church. Radiant Church Jackson is a part of the Radiant Network, which has over 50 churches across the U.S. and one in Mexico.
Today we're going to hear the story of another experience at Radiant Church Jackson and that person's exit from there as well. We're doing this, if you listen to our first episode, we gave a lot more details on why we were sharing these stories, but a brief overview. We're doing this with a heavy heart. We're not trying to destroy the Big C Church. That's what I call the followers of Jesus. We love the church. However, we believe there is unrepentant sin within the leadership of Radiant Church Jackson. And since the elders have refused to address it, we are following the command of 1 Timothy 5:20. But those elders who are sinning, you are to reprove before everyone, so that the others may take warning.
Yeah, so if you listened to episode 1, you know a lot of this already, but we're just going over it again. Um, why are we sharing stories? Why is that important? Well, for us, our eyes were open to the abuse that we were seeing at Radiant Church Jackson when we heard the stories of women who had come out of IHOP KC, which stands for International House of Prayer, Kansas City, right? Um, we went into way more details in episode 1, but before we heard these stories, we had been paying attention to our own red flags, but we didn't realize really how bad things were until we heard those stories from those brave women. So, our stories in episode 1. In addition to our own story, almost every story we have heard from victims of abuse, their eyes were opened from hearing someone else's story. So we are sharing stories in order to expose the sin of the leadership of Radiant Jackson and hopefully encourage other victims of spiritual abuse and also open people's eyes who don't realize that they're being abused.
And we're going to start with some definitions, just like we did last time. First definition of spiritual abuse that we're using, it's by Michael J. Kruger, the author of Bully Pulpit. Spiritual abuse is when a spiritual leader, such as a pastor, elder, or head of a Christian organization, wields his position of spiritual authority in such a way that he manipulates, domineers, bullies, and intimidates those under him as a means of accomplishing what he takes to be biblical and or spiritual goals. And also, if we say Radiant throughout, we're going to be talking about Radiant Jackson now. As we mentioned, there's lots of other Radiant churches. There's Radiant Network. If we're talking about one of those, we will be specific as to which one we're talking about.
And also, we really want to say thank you to everyone who has reached out to us with your own stories. We heard a lot. It's been, at this recording, it's been 10 days since we released the podcast. And just thank you for trusting us with your stories. Thank you for sharing the podcast on various platforms. And just, we encourage you to keep finding safe people to share your own stories to, because there's a lot of power in learning from each other and the things God's teaching us. All right, so we got the business out of the way. Now we're going to introduce Heather. Heather, thanks for coming on. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me and for giving me the opportunity to talk and just share what I've experienced.
Yeah, we're excited to have you here. Can you introduce yourself and tell everybody a little about you?
My name is Heather, and I attended Radiant Jackson from 2019, 2020, around that time frame, through the fall of 2024. I am intentionally being vague about certain details of my story because there's other people involved that I don't want to reveal their names on a public forum. And, I'm a very introverted and private person. And so sharing private details of my life on a public forum is a little overwhelming. And there is some fear of backlash in regards to some of the details that I'm going to be sharing today on my story. So my story, just with observing the patterns in Radiant, kind of begins with my own story of leaving a relationship with somebody that I was with for a few years, and it had turned abusive in nature, and that person attended Radiant as well. And when I left that relationship in 2023, I was at a place of trying to find community in the church, I was new to the Jackson area. I had just relocated, and I wanted to stick it out at Radiant because my daughter was involved there. I wanted to continue my journey of finding community in that church. And I figured the church was big enough where I could avoid that other person without issue. Part of my uh, healing process from that relationship, I dug into discovering who Jesus was. I've known him since I was a little girl, but I didn't really understand what it meant to walk with him as a daughter. And so in 2023, I just launched into a healing journey of sitting with Jesus at home for multiple hours a day. I developed a prayer closet. I just sat in his presence and let him just pour into me. And as time went on, a couple months passed from that relationship, and I realized I needed some additional help with just overcoming why I was in that space and why I had walked through a relationship like that. And so I sought the services of the counseling center. There's a counseling ministry center attached to Radiant Jackson. And I went in there just completely open with investigating why I was in that place of being in a toxic relationship. I shared everything of my past. I shared everything about what had landed me in that position. And I just had hopes of pursuing just wholeness and health and healing. And um, I received healing throughout that year, but I believe it was the result of me sitting with Jesus and me pursuing Jesus. And he showed up for me every time I pursued him. And that's where my healing came from. Um, Me sharing my story is not from a place of bitterness. It's not from a place of unforgiveness about the events that I'm talking about. I've healed. I've spent the last 6 months completely healing and forgiving and overcoming some of the things that I've walked through at Radiant. So that's not why I'm speaking out on this today. So the reason I'm sharing what I walked through and the reason why I'm disclosing the events that occurred while I was there is because I feel like I have witnessed a pattern at Radiant through things that I've seen myself while attending, through firsthand stories that I've heard from other people. There's a pattern of unhealthy behavior, and there's a pattern of putting people in a place of being manipulated and treated in unhealthy ways. And it's really important to me that, from the perspective of a woman, that women have the ability to speak their truth, to speak about their journey and their healing process while they're in the midst of it. And I didn't feel like I had that opportunity. I felt like my voice was silenced. I felt like I was oppressed. I felt like I was put in a position where I could not share what I was going through. Um, on day one of my pursuit in counseling, I was told to not share the circumstances of um, the techniques of my counseling because there was overlap with so many other people at Radiant who use those counseling services, and they didn't want their techniques to be publicly known because it might hinder somebody else from coming to counseling. And I and so I took that to heart. I didn't share much about my counseling journey because I was given that instruction, and I didn't want to hinder somebody else, which didn't make much sense now that I'm looking. It doesn't make much sense now in retrospect because the counseling services that were provided, like the techniques that were used, are common counseling techniques. So I don't know why it was spoken to me that that needed to be a secret. There was nothing unique or unusual about the approach. They were standard counseling techniques. So from day one of my counseling there, I felt like I could not speak about what I was walking through. And that standard was kind of set from day one. There were some incidences that arose throughout my counseling experiences there where I needed help with that other person that I had left the relationship from. There was a couple of circumstances where I asked for specific help navigating that circumstance, and I was told that pastoral staff would not become involved in my circumstance unless it impacted the integrity or the structure of the church. And my circumstance affected other people around me, and that's why it was so important for me to get help. And when I was told that the pastoral staff would not become involved, that just kind of sent me into a tailspin of, okay, well, I guess this isn't important enough, or I just need to navigate this by myself. It just made me feel really isolated in that circumstance that I was dealing with. And, just for clarification, the things that was navigating had nothing to do with me wanting to remove the other person from the church. I felt like the church was big enough I could attend without running into these issues, and that didn't seem to be the case. And so my heart and my intent was to ask for help navigating it and not necessarily ejecting the other person from the church. That was not my approach. That's not what I wanted. In my opinion, I felt like the other person probably needed to be at church. So when I was in counseling, I was also told to pray for protection over my home and my family um, from that other person that I was dealing with. I was told to block that other person on all avenues, phone, social media. Um, that person was involved in greeting sometimes at the door, and so I was told to use another entrance if I had an issue with walking in the same area. Um, and I willingly did those things because I did not want to cause an issue. I didn't want to cause a scene. I didn't want to create more drama. I just wanted to attend church in a safe space. I unfortunately did not receive that safe feeling at church. I had chronic anxiety while at church. I had repeated anxiety attacks, panic attacks. It wasn't until I sat for a long period of time, for basically the whole of 2023, I sat with Jesus at home, and he helped heal some of that stuff for me, where I could attend without the chronic anxiety or the panic attacks. Entering into 2024, I started to get more involved and started serving regularly, started becoming invested in women's ministry, started leading some women's groups, got involved with Bible studies. And um, towards the end of 2024, I was invited to participate in a leadership training group called Equip. And um, leading up to that, there was a lot going on in the church. Kyle and Laura shared their story already with what they've experienced. I was aware of a little bit of what was going on with them. I was aware when they left the church in the summer of 2024. I knew some of what was going on around them with why they left. I didn't have a completely full picture of everything that was going on with Radiant until I left in October of 2024. Um, I felt like I knew pieces from what Kyle and Laura had shared. And then when I left in October of 2024, I started kind of looking at the whole picture, and just it was mind blowing to see the patterns similar to what I had experienced. What triggered me to finally leave for good, when I was invited to join that leadership class, I went to the first one. I think it was the beginning of October. And the person that I had been trying to avoid was in that class. I had a really hard time staying for the length of the class because there was just a lot of anxiety involved. While I was in the class, about halfway through, my phone malfunctioned. I brought up the Bible app on my phone to follow along with some scriptures that were being referenced. And I accidentally hit audio on my phone, so it went off, and started reading the verse out loud. It was a funny moment. Everybody laughed, but I got the word I would use is corrected by Pastor Mike, who was leading the class. It was said something to the effect of, "Oh, you must have something more important going on over there." That was I had minimal interaction with Pastor Mike up until then. I just had never really had much of a reason to interact with him, and that was, I might have spoken to him once or twice before, and that was kind of my first real visual and of what he was like. And I just left that class devastated, that I had to sit in that environment with somebody that I had issues with previously, and also to be publicly corrected in an environment where I was already feeling really sensitive and just having a really hard time. And I left that and I went to church one more Sunday because I was plugged in to serve. And that was my last Sunday there. I went to the person who had previously counseled me and just expressed my issues with participating in a class with that other person there. And I was told that I was handpicked for the class because it's invitation only, and that Pastor Mike doesn't know about my situation, and that I should really stick it out because leaving that class would be a form of isolation. Never mind the fact that I was involved in other areas. And so to me, that was just a total disregard for my space to worship, for my space to have community. Um, I had talked a couple other times about leaving the church because I had seen a lot of red flags kind of pop up. There was just a lot of discomfort for me to still be there. And so that summer of 2024, I kind of brought up a couple of times that I thought I should leave. And I was told, "You're an influencer here and you have gifts that are needed here. And when you're in that position, you get attacked. And that's what's happening." And I, in retrospect, I replay those words in my head, and I'm a daughter first. And that's one thing that I learned sitting with Jesus the last couple of years is I'm his daughter first. And if my church community, if my church leadership, I shouldn't say community because I still have good friends still there and they treated me well. But if my church leadership is not treating me as a daughter first, that's a problem because that's the core of my identity. And that's the core of who Jesus created me to be. And it's not fair to me and to other women and to other men who are pursuing their identity as sons and daughters to be disregarded in that element. It's not right. And that's why I'm speaking out, because there's a pattern of this across Radiant. I've seen it, I've heard it firsthand. There's a pattern and it's not okay. And so, me speaking out is to just, I guess, plead on behalf of the people that have been impacted. I'm pleading to the leadership. I'm pleading to the people that orchestrate the structure of this network of Radiant Jackson. Make some changes so that my experience doesn't have to be replicated. You have the ability, you are empowered in your role at this church to make it better, to make it different, make it biblical. Treat your people that you are shepherding as sons and daughters first.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We really appreciate you coming here and telling your story. Is it okay if I ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
Okay, so a story that you shared earlier about a new issue arose with your ex, and you were in counseling about it, and you were encouraged just to sort it out with this person, right? With him, not the counselor.
I was not necessarily encouraged to sort it out with the ex. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
I was not encouraged to sort it out with the ex. I was encouraged to block him at all costs and to not interact with him whatsoever.
And then church leadership, like your counselor, also wanted nothing to do with him.
As
Or
far
what
as
did that
I
look like to you?
as far as I know, he knew who the person was.
Mhm.
He had interactions with him previously. As far as I know, I am not aware. I was not informed of any interactions going forward.
Part that sticks out to me, like you went to your counselor for help. And I just want to clarify and have it on the record. And they said they didn't want to get involved, or the church leadership would not get involved in your personal matters. Is that
Yes.
essentially what they said?
That's what I was told by this one person. Yes.
And then they're said to block them, to get them out of your life, but
Fast forward a year, and it's okay for me to sit in a classroom with them when I had to pray for protection over my home the previous year. I mean, I understand we're in a church environment and there's, room for repentance and there's room for growth and to change and forgiveness and all. I understand that. And that's not where this story is coming from. There's been no repentance in this situation. And, quite frankly, when you're trying to heal from traumatic things, it's really hard to heal from those traumatic things when that thing is in front of you.
Yeah.
It's equivalent to you went through a really bad fire and your skin is blistered. If you go stand in front of a flame, that blister is going to pop every time because you don't have the protection of that thick skin. And that's what it felt like for me from 2023 to 2024. I was constantly under fire and my skin, it felt like my soul was constantly blistered.
did you talk with your counselor about leaving Radiant at all because of this
Yes.
situations? What was his advice, I guess?
I was told that leaving would be equivalent to quitting or giving up. I talked about possibly relocating as of moving, and I was told to make sure I move to an area or a community that has a Radiant church, which, looking back, you piece it all together and it just all sounds really ridiculous now that you talk about it out loud. That in the moment, when you're trying to heal and you're just fighting to find some normalcy in your life, you just take what you're told and try to work with it.
Yeah, how you shared that they encouraged you to just use a different door that he was greeting at is wild to me.
Yeah.
Like you had to be, I wonder why you had to be the one that had to keep making the changes and why you had to keep being the one to be sacrificing, or like why were you having to do all these things? I mean, maybe this is a rhetorical question, but it just struck me as like all the burden is on you and it's kept being put on you. It's not right, I guess, is what it comes to.
Yeah, you had mentioned too that like for 2 years, church didn't feel safe.
Yeah.
I think for those who have been through spiritual abuse, you will understand that. I guess my counselor said maybe it'll resonate with you, but just feel I should share. Like it's like you have an open wound, and every time then you go into church because that's where you got the wound. Or at least for us, for me, I will speak for me personally. My wounds were from church, and so when I go into church, I am trying to protect that wound and expecting from every side that something's going to hit that wound. And just like if you had an actual wound, when you flinch, it hurts. I didn't even know that was a thing until we were in the middle of it. So I don't know, I guess I'm just hoping if someone is hearing that and you're in that spot of feeling like church isn't safe, like, you're not alone is where I'm going with this, I guess.
I think when you go through a trauma, anything that sort of seems like the same thing is going to like re-trigger you or make you think of those things again. And I think that's normal. That's part of the process of healing. Because your brain has been wired to think, oh, this is dangerous. And then you're on alert and trying to figure out, how do I keep myself safe? That's just like what your brain wants to do.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And I think in my situation, that other person could have walked through his own healing and been, in a better place. I wasn't in a position to know that because I was not pursuing interaction. We did not interact. But my impressions of that person were still real and raw, and I did not have the opportunity to fully heal from that. Fast forward now, I've been out of that church for 6 months and I'm in a much better place. I'm stronger. I could probably walk in and be okay, in the same environment with that person. But I never, while I was there, I did not have the opportunity to have that safe space to heal and to discover what it feels like to walk in and walk past that person and not have anxiety or a panic attack.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad you're out.
Me too.
A question I have for you, you kind of mentioned some red flags. So now that you've been out for 6 months or so, you said, what kind of red flags are you now looking at so people who are listening can think maybe hear their own things and
Yeah, there's a few things that kind of just in the moment, I wouldn't have called them red flags necessarily, but they kinda gave me that ick, like when you see something and it's like, that doesn't it feels a little funny in my gut.
yeah.
Like one of the first things was, Lee Cummings. He's the, head of the Radiant Network. He would come and guest speak every once in a while, and every time he came, he would promote his books from the stage and from the pulpit. And to me, that gave me an ick feeling of you are kind of our ultimate leader, right? Like you are the in position, you're the ultimate shepherd of this organization, of this church, and you are peddling your books to the people that you were shepherding. That was one thing that just always did not sit right with me. Another kind of ick was Easter Sunday. I think it was 2024. It was around the same time the second campus had launched,
Yep.
so 2024. Easter Sunday, we walked in. I was with my daughter. We walked in and they started selling merchandise like the t-shirts and sweatshirts and I'm not opposed to church merchandise. I mean every church does that and I have shirts too.
Big ones do.
Um, okay, I shouldn't say every year,
Right.
but that's not something I've ever really been opposed to. But Easter weekend, for me, that's a holy time, and I spend time leading up to that, just preparing to encounter service. And that 2024, we walk in and front and center in the lobby, there's a big rack of things to buy with Radiant across, and my daughter, I have a young adult daughter, and she was like, "Mom, that doesn't seem right. Like, why on Easter?" And it just didn't sit right. It felt like going to a funeral, and the funeral was selling you a T-shirt with the funeral home's name on it.
Wow.
That's how it felt, and it just left a bad taste in my mouth.
Mm.
Some other red flags. Pastor Mike was always correcting the sound booth with the slides if there was a mistake on the slides, or I knew people that wanted to volunteer in the sound booth, but were afraid to after kind of witnessing that because they didn't want to be publicly humiliated or corrected. There was just kind of this sense of perfectionism, which I don't think belongs necessarily in the church because we are all imperfect people. And I think pushing people to the point of perfectionism is not okay. Um, there was just a ongoing lack of transparency, lack of communication, a lot of poor communication. My time there, I served in kids ministry for a little bit. Kids ministry is always understaffed and just low on volunteers, or at least that was my experience when I served there. And I had actually brought it up to somebody on staff. As one of the pastors, they said, "Hey, other churches I've been in, they have always promoted volunteering on stage. Like once a month, you hear a message of, not a message, but just a blurb of like, hey, we need help. Like, please step up. We need your help." And, um, you know, I asked, like, I don't see them doing that here. And there's a desperate need for help in kids ministry. And that person I spoke to said, "Oh, well, that's the kids ministry's pastor's job. So he has to do that." And that was just, I don't know, like it didn't seem right.
Yeah, I also served in children's ministry, and it wasn't until, um, I started paying attention to other churches. Our in-laws attend a different church, and I she had told me that they don't have the same people work the same Sunday. I mean, the same class time every week, and that's what we were supposed to do at Radiant. They wanted us in there every Sunday for the same class time. And I think I might have said this in episode 1, but the reason they gave was so that the kids and the parents, especially the young ones, the young kids, they recognize the person who's in the classroom so they feel comfortable. And as a young mom at the time, I understood that and it made sense to me. But then I realized what like a heavy burden that was for me to be there 9 a.m., same class every Sunday. And I didn't realize that a lot of churches don't do that, that they actually don't want their people to be serving every Sunday. And then I started thinking, at such a big church, why are we not giving our people a break in children's ministry?
Yeah. Yeah. I just observed a big lack of communication with that. It was just, it didn't.
It's not a priority like you want servers in all these other areas, but children's ministry, it felt to me like once they had one body in that spot, like all of the slots were filled with people, they just considered it done. And I really felt like a number.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I thrived in that environment. I loved being there every week. I loved doing it, but that's because I'm the weird one. I found out it was built to just go. Where like for you, Laura, you were destroyed.
Yeah,
Constant
it
need to be there.
definitely it contributed to my burnout for sure because we had 2 young kids at the time that I was at home with every day, and then I would serve on Sunday. Again, like, I know these are my choices, I recognize this, but it wasn't until I got outside counseling, not from the church's ministry center, but somebody else that did my counseling, I realized, like, I should be setting my own boundaries here, and it was not good for me to be so burdened with a job at the church that was a volunteer position.
And I've noticed too that when people are plugged in, with my experience at kids ministry, there's, if you feel compelled or called or God speaks to you to maybe you're supposed to serve over in this other area instead, it's really hard to shift.
Yeah,
Like
it is.
once you are in, you're locked in. And there's this narrative of like there's not enough people to, if you leave this position, then there's nobody to fill it. So then for me, it's like, oh, I feel bad. I don't want to have a hole there. But there's other people that I talked to that felt led to serve in another ministry and they had that same mentality of like, oh, but I'm needed here. I don't want to leave a hole. But then yet it's not being presented on stage to the congregation. Hey, we have holes here. Let's fill them. Can you if you're not volunteering, step up. I think there's when I had asked about it, I said, oh, there's a once a year sermon that Pastor Mike does to encourage volunteering. And it's like, well, this is an ongoing thing. Why not talk about it every month instead of one sermon? Well, you can do an announcement every month. Hey, volunteer. Just communication.
Any other red flags?
I did have a few women kind of make comments over the last couple of years that they had issues with some secrecy, mainly involved around the women's events. They said it felt like it was a cult and it really bothered them that there was secrecy. And, there was other comments with women concerned about just changes within the church. I think they took away the prayer night during the launch of the second campus. And, there was a weekly prayer time where everybody could come together for a prayer meeting. And there was just women that came to me with concerns. And, I feel compelled now that I'm talking about it to apologize to those women because I explained it away. I explained it on behalf of the church instead of sitting with you in that space and exploring if the Holy Spirit was talking to you about something. And I feel like I explained away your discernment. And so I would just like to apologize to those women that I didn't honor your discernment and what the Holy Spirit might have been speaking to you. Because I know I ignored my own sense of discernment during that time. And so I'm sorry that I did the same for you.
Yeah, when you said earlier about there were certain techniques in your counseling, I was like, techniques? That was a curious choice of words to me, and then later you had said that it was, like, normal counseling stuff, but they had told you not to be sharing it. Can you elaborate on that more?
Um,
I mean, maybe without sharing all their secrets. Yeah, I don't want they don't want their secret shared.
I think just my goal for counseling was to address inner healing, childhood trauma. I really wanted to get to the root of why I was repeating certain patterns. And so, s- there was a lot of talk therapy around that. There was like an empty chair routine where you speak to the person who maybe traumatized you, as if they were in that chair. They were very effective for me. They worked because they're proven psychology treatment techniques. Other psychologists use them as well. So I'm not really completely sure what I was not supposed to talk about other than, yeah, I don't really have a full explanation of why that was a secret.
That's okay. I also was like, that's honesty.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it blends to what we've been saying about just a general culture of secrecy. You
Yes.
don't want things talked about, like you said, with the events, or like people had issues with the secrecy there.
Yeah.
It's counseling. Like you, you as the person being counseled should be able to talk about it with whoever you need to talk about it. It just bothers me.
All right, Heather, thank you so much. We have a few more questions here. Is there anything you would like to say to other victims who listen to this?
I would say that you know the sound of the Lord's voice, and you know when the Holy Spirit is speaking to you. And um, sometimes in situations like this in a church environment, what you're hearing in the church can be the opposite of what the Holy Spirit is telling you. And so I would just like to say that you're not crazy for leaving an abusive environment, that God is with you in the midst of it, that you will be okay, that there's a grieving process that happens. It took me 6 months to even want to talk about this stuff. It's been 6 months and I'm still not sure about church. I know I'll go back to church. I just don't know what that looks like. Um, your story is unique, but sadly not unique. I think your healing process um, is unique because it's between you and God. And I believe that God has a specific purpose for calling people out of situations where they've been traumatized or victimized, and that He will work it together for the good.
Yeah, I think you hit some of these here, but what were your emotions and feelings and things as you left Radiant and that process? Because I think that'll also speak to those victims as well.
Um, there was a huge sense of relief that first Sunday that I knew I was done and I left. I felt like I could finally breathe again. Like I hadn't realized for the last couple of years leading up to that point that it felt like something was covering like my nose and my mouth where I couldn't take a deep breath. And so I just spent like a few weeks just inhaling and just kind of sitting in a space of peace. Yeah, that's the thing that sticks out the most is that I felt like I could finally breathe again. There was a grieving process. I was really sad, depressed for a little bit because I was grieving the loss of a community. There was anger intermingled in there because of people, myself and others being treated unjustly. Um, that's a word. Justly. They might have just made that up. But being treated not appropriately. There's sadness in that. There's anger that's involved in that. But I've come through that to a place of knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that I belong to Jesus and that His voice is the only one that really matters in the situation for me. And I wouldn't trade that for anything.
Is there anything you would want to say to the leaders of Radiant Jackson or to other pastors who might be listening to this?
I would say, actually, I'm going to refer to a verse because when I asked God recently what church should look like for me going forward, He highlighted something very specific for me personally. And I feel like this should be what the church should be embracing. Um, Specifically, I heard the words that church should involve the least of these. And so that took me to that verse in Matthew 25, starting at 35. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. And so for me, to leadership and to pastors, this should be the core of your ministry. If you are not approaching ministry through the lens of this verse, then something needs to be corrected. And so I would just encourage you to look at the people around you that you're shepherding. And if they feel like they're the recipient of this verse in your church, in your ministry, then you're doing a job well done. If there's room for improvement, I would encourage you to look at what needs to be improved.
Do you have any resources for anyone?
Yeah,
we
resources
can share?
that have helped you in this healing process.
I read the books. I think you guys referenced them in the last podcast, the Bully Pulpit book and then the Church of Tove. Those both books were really helpful for me to just gain an understanding of what I had just walked through. Lisa Turkhurst, she's an excellent author. I've read a lot of her books, done a lot of her Bible studies. She has some really good resources when recovering from traumatic events. There's books on forgiveness and healing. Those were very beneficial to me.
Thank you. That's awesome.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. So we're called Faith in the Fallout, and we're gonna end it like we did last time, or try to just through the fallout of all the things that have happened. How has just your faith been encouraged? What's God been doing that's cool in the middle of it? Is a terrible way to ask.
Now I get what you mean. 'Cause, God shows up in the midst of chaos every time.
That's much better. Yes.
My relationship with my daughter and my mom has grown abundantly in the last 6 months. And I'm grateful for that. God always knows exactly what you need when you need it. And yeah, that's where I'm at with this.
Well, thank you, Heather. And just thank you for being willing to share your story. That is extremely difficult. Yeah, I don't know what to say. I'm so grateful that you have chosen to do this and chosen to come forward.
Yeah, thank you, because we know it's a risk. And we're gonna keep praying for you and for your family. Thank you for trusting us with this part of your story.
And if any of you out there want to reach out directly to Heather, you can.
Well, not directly.
Well, yes, it'll go through us. So,
Okay,
but if
good
you don't
saying.
trust us, then you can just say, "Hey, here's." Please give my contact info to Heather. But you can email faithinthefallout@gmail.com, or you can go to the website faithinthefallout.com, and there's a contact form thing on there that you
Yeah.
can, and we can direct that to Heather for her to reach out to you.
Yeah, so thanks everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again later.